The dense forests of Guatemala hold secrets older than the conquistadors who once sought to claim them. Among temples swallowed by vegetation and trails long forgotten by time, whispers tell of figures that move through the ruins, dressed in colonial-era attire, yet with no eyes to see, no mouth to speak, no face to exist. The first accounts of the faceless walkers date back to the 15th century, when Spanish explorers, driven by gold and glory, began their incursions into the sacred lands of the Mayan people. Soldiers reported visions of these pale, silent figures, always watching from the shadows of abandoned temples. Some dared to follow them. None returned. The indigenous people warned they were neither men nor ghosts, but guardians of the forgotten gods. They had protected these places for centuries, and they would continue to do so, punishing anyone who dared to disturb what was never meant to be touched. Even today at nightfall, those who venture into the ruins claim to hear footsteps in the darkness, even when no one else is there. And sometimes, just sometimes, something without a face stares back. Guatemala, 1529. The heat was suffocating, and the jungle's humid air clung to my skin like an invisible curse. We had been walking for days, hacking through the thick vegetation with dull blades, following hand-drawn maps and the vague directions of indigenous guides. Our mission was simple: find gold, seize temples, and bring glory to the Spanish crown. Rodrigo de Olmos was just a soldier, one of many who had left Spain chasing riches and hollow promises of glory. But unlike the others, I felt the weight of the jungle. Something was wrong. From the moment we set foot here, I knew we were being watched. Our leader, Captain Diego de Ayala, was a ruthless man. He didn't believe in legends or curses. To him, power and steel were the only truths that mattered. But the natives who guided us knew something we didn't. The Mayan men we had hired barely spoke to us. The oldest among them, Itzam Balam, refused to go any further when we revealed our destination. "There are places even the dead should not walk," he murmured. Diego laughed, calling him a coward. As the old man turned away, one of the younger guides, Tuk, simply lowered his head and followed. The trail grew denser with every step. The twisted trees blocked out the sunlight, and the silence was suffocating. No birds, no insects, no wind. Just the muffled sound of our boots sinking into the damp earth. And then we saw the first sign that something was wrong. A rusted Spanish armor lay abandoned in the middle of the path. It looked ancient, consumed by time, and the jungle's relentless moisture. Beside it, a broken sword. "Someone was here before us," murmured Fernan, a veteran of many campaigns. Diego kicked the armor aside, indifferent. "Or someone ran away like a rat. Keep moving." But something bothered me. Where was the body? There were no bones, no signs of a struggle, just empty metal, discarded like a hollow shell. We made camp at dusk in a cramped clearing. The fire flickered, casting dark shadows against the twisted trees. The indigenous guides would not speak. They sat together, whispering among themselves, throwing small handfuls of ash onto the ground, as if trying to ward off something unseen. I approached Tuk, asking him what was wrong. He hesitated, his eyes full of something I couldn't quite place. Then he whispered, "The faceless walkers are already here." A chill crawled up my spine. Before I could ask what he meant, a scream tore through the night. One of our soldiers was gone. We ran to where he had been. No blood, no signs of struggle. Only his sword abandoned in the dirt, and footprints. Footprints that led to nowhere. The jungle was alive, and it wanted us there. The jungle felt different that morning. The air was heavier, pressing down on us like an unseen force. We marched forward, exhausted, the stench of sweat and mud clinging to our clothes. The absolute silence of the forest continued to follow us, and that was what unsettled me the most. And then, we saw them. 4 Maya men hidden among the trees, watching us with wide eyes filled with terror. "Run!" one of them shouted before they all turned to flee. But we were faster. 2 of them were, tackled before they could take 3 steps. The third tripped and fell to his knees. The last one almost escaped, but Fernan struck him down with the butt of his sword. Captain Diego de Ayala approached, looking over the prisoners with disdain. They were thin, covered in mud, as if they had been running for days. "Ask them what they're doing here," Diego ordered one of our interpreters. The oldest of the group, a man with weathered skin and tribal tattoos, lifted his gaze to Diego. There was no fear in his eyes, just a tired expression, as if he already knew how this would end. "This is Itzam Balam Tuk," our guide murmured. "A shaman," Diego smirked, amused. "Then ask the old sorcerer why he's spying on us." The interpreter translated, and the shaman answered calmly without hesitation. "You shouldn't be here." Diego crossed his arms. "And why is that?" "Because your people fear our cannons?" The shaman didn't look away. "Because you have awakened the guardians of the forgotten gods." A cold silence fell over the camp. Some of our men exchanged uneasy glances. Even I, ever the skeptic, felt a shiver crawl up my spine. "The Faceless walkers have already seen you. They are already following you." Tuk took a step back. He believed. "But Diego?" He laughed. "Another legend to scare children. Your gods are already dead, old man." The shaman remained calm, but his eyes said something else. "You will not leave this jungle." Diego ordered the execution of the 3 prisoners. The soldiers dragged them to the edge of the camp. I didn't watch, but I listened. I heard the blades cutting through flesh. I heard the shaman's final breath, and I heard something else. Something beyond that. In the seconds after the deadly silence, the birds began to sing. For the first time in days, the jungle seemed to wake up. But it wasn't natural. It was a call. And that night I finally understood. The jungle wasn't silent because it was dead. It was listening. It was waiting, and now it was answering. We pushed forward for 3 more days through the jungle. The heat and humidity made every step torturous. The stench of rotting vegetation and damp earth clung to our clothes, and the insects gave us no rest. But the worst part was the silence. Since the execution of the shaman, something had shifted around us. The jungle was watching. There were moments when I could swear I heard footsteps behind us, but every time I turned around, nothing. No snapping branches, no rustling leaves, just the invisible weight of something there, something we didn't want to see. Then, Tuk suddenly stopped. "We're here." And there it was, the temple rising before a forgotten ruin, half consumed by the jungle, as if the forest itself was trying to bury it. The ancient stones, worn by time, were covered in moss and vines. Trees had grown through the cracks, their roots coiling around the walls like serpents strangling history. But when we stepped inside, discomfort turned into fear. The walls were covered in strange carvings, figures of men in ceremonial robes, kneeling, offering something to larger beings in the background. But these beings, they had no faces, no features, no eyes, no mouths, just empty human shapes like shadows trapped in stone. I couldn't explain why, but something about those images made my skin crawl. Then I noticed the footprints. In the thick dust on the floor, there were fresh tracks. I stopped breathing. For a moment, none of us had stepped inside yet, so who had been in the temple before us? "Look at this," one of the soldiers shouted, pulling me from my thoughts. He held a golden idol, a twisted representation of some deformed creature. The others started grabbing the offerings, ceramic vases, jewelry, ornate masks. Captain Diego de Ayala lifted a golden disc, running his fingers over the carvings before smirking. "The crown will pay handsomely for this." That was when Tuk, our guide, took a step back and murmured, "You shouldn't touch that." Diego ignored him. He shoved the disc into his leather bag. The other soldiers followed his lead. One of them kicked an offering bowl, spilling ashes across the floor. Another knocked over a small statue, cracking it in half. They laughed. They joked, as if they didn't feel the weight of what they were doing. But I did. And then the smell changed. The humidity, the mold, the sweat. All of it was overpowered by something stronger. rot, like old flesh, like bodies buried for too long. No one else seemed to notice. But I did. And at the back of the temple, in the dark hallway that none of us had explored yet, I swear I saw a shadow move. The campfire crackled at the center of our encampment, but its heat did nothing to drive away the cold that seemed to come from inside the jungle itself. Something about that night felt different. The wind was gone, and the usual chorus of insects and night birds had fallen silent. After looting the temple, Diego had ordered us to set up camp a few miles from the ruins. The gold taken from the offerings had been divided among the men, and the tension of the journey seemed to have eased. But that was only for those who weren't paying attention. Fernan, one of the veterans, had been uneasy since we left the temple. He had been one of the first to enter, and also the one who had destroyed a statue of a stone idol. Damn savages, he had laughed at the time. Now, he was pale and silent, drinking without saying a word. Gold is gold, whether it belongs to a Christian or a pagan, but I have to admit, that place gave me chills, he told me earlier. I should have paid more attention. In the dead of night, I woke up startled. Someone was calling for Fernan. At first, I thought I was dreaming. Then I heard it again. Fernan? Where the hell are you? I sat up, still groggy from sleep. The camp was restless. 2 soldiers were circling the area, and Diego stood there, his face cold as stone. The bastard's gone. The firelight flickered on our faces, but it couldn't reach the trees. Beyond the clearing, I scanned the area, looking for any sign of him. Nothing. The other soldiers armed themselves, ready for the worst. We grabbed torches and began the search. It didn't take long to find a clue. A few yards away from the clearing, something metallic caught the torchlight. Fernand's sword. Beside it lay his musket, his helmet, and his dagger, all of it discarded, as if he had simply vanished in the middle of a step. But there was no blood, and there were no footprints. That was what made my blood run cold. The ground was soft, covered in dirt and dry leaves. If he had run, he would have left tracks. If he had been dragged away, there would be a trail, but there was nothing. It was as if he had never existed at all. I saw something. That was when Took, the indigenous guide, appeared. His eyes were wide, glowing in the torchlight. He didn't look surprised. I saw something, he murmured hesitantly. Diego spun around, irritated. What? Took looked at the darkness beyond, the trees. His skin was slick with sweat, his lips trembling. Shadows. They were among the trees, watching. A knot tightened in my stomach. Diego laughed. Enough. Fernan got lost like an idiot or was eaten by some beast. We'll search for him at dawn. No one argued. We just returned to the fire, pretending to believe him. That night I couldn't sleep, and when I finally drifted off, I had a dream. I saw Fernan. He was standing at the edge of the camp, staring at us. But something was wrong. His face wasn't there. No eyes, no mouth, just a hollow shadow dressed in his armor. Then he took a step forward, and I woke up with a scream caught in my throat. But no one woke up, because the entire camp had already fallen silent. That night no one really slept. Since Fernand's disappearance, the camp felt different. The fire still crackled, the torches still cast shadows across the trees, but the air felt wrong. It was heavier, thicker, as if the jungle itself was breathing around us. And then came the footsteps. At first they were just distant snaps, branches breaking, leaves rustling. Nothing unusual, nothing that couldn't be blamed on some wandering animal. But then slowly, the sounds became too distinct, steady, deliberate, human. I was sitting by the fire when I noticed. The sounds were coming from all sides. Something, or someone, was circling us. I looked at Diego. He tried to maintain his usual commanding presence, but I could see it, the way his fingers gripped the hilt of his sword tighter than usual. The other soldiers were already on their feet, weapons ready, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. "Who's there?" Hernando, one of the recruits, shouted. Silence. And then, I saw them. At first, just a blur between the trees, a tall silhouette standing still. Then another one further back, pale, motionless, wearing something that looked like old garments draped and worn. I blinked. My heart pounded against my ribs. The others saw them too. Some of the men muttered prayers, clutching crucifixes with sweaty fingers. The figures did not move. They only watched. And then, suddenly, they were gone. "After them!" Diego shouted, unsheathing his sword. The soldiers charged into the forest, torches lighting their path. Every instinct in me screamed not to follow. But I did. We all did. We ran with fear in our chests, but we ran anyway. The footsteps led us to an area of soft dirt, and there we finally found tracks. Human footprints. But what we saw next made my blood turn to ice. The footprints ended abruptly. There was no sign of escape. No sudden jump, no change in direction. It was as if whatever had been walking there simply ceased to exist. This isn't possible," one of the soldiers whispered. Tuk, the native guide, stepped forward. He stared at the footprints, then silently tossed a handful of ashes over them. "You saw them," he murmured. "Now they see you too." Diego snorted, forcing a laugh. "Nonsense, let's head back to camp." But when we turned around, we realized something even worse. The way back was gone. The forest. It wasn't the same anymore. The path we had taken simply wasn't there. It was as if we had stepped into a place that had never existed before. And that's when I knew we were not alone, and we never would be again. The jungle had changed, and so had we. Since we found those footprints that led to nowhere, something had shifted in the group. We didn't speak about it, but we all knew. Fear had taken root in our bones, like a silent plague spreading through our veins. That night, the camp was tense. The fire crackled, but it gave no warmth. The silence was as thick as mud, and everyone's eyes kept shifting, scanning the darkness around us, until we noticed. Hernando was gone. "This is their doing." Panic spread like wildfire through the camp. "He was just here," one of the soldiers shouted. The forest didn't answer. Nothing did. I stepped closer to where Hernando had been sleeping. His boots were still there. His musket, too. It was as if he had been taken from inside his own skin. "This isn't normal," I muttered. But Diego wasn't listening. He needed someone to blame. He spun around, pointing his sword at the native guides. His face was dark, his eyes feverish. "This is their doing. They cursed us!" Tuk and the others backed away, but Diego had already made up his mind. He drew his pistol, leveling it at Tuk's chest, but Tuk didn't beg. He didn't run. He only looked at the shaman, Itzam Balam, who remained stone-faced. "Nothing to say, witch?" Diego sneered, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Not going to save your man?" The shaman breathed in deeply, and then, in a voice as heavy as the jungle itself, he said, "It is already done. None of you will leave this place alive." Diego laughed and pulled the trigger. The gunshot ripped through the forest like thunder. Tuk fell without a sound, his body twisting on the dirt. And then, the jungle moved. The branches above us swayed even though there was no wind. The ground trembled beneath our feet. The shadows deepened, and in the darkness, eyes began to glow. I saw them standing between the trees, tall, still, wearing ancient garments. Their faces were nothing but smooth, pale surfaces. No eyes, no mouths, nothing. My blood ran cold. They were closer now. Diego saw them too. For the first time, the iron-hearted captain had no words. The soldiers clutched their weapons, but something deep inside me knew it wouldn't matter. The shaman, still, standing, stared at Diego. "You disturbed what was never meant to be disturbed. Now the guardians have come to take your souls." The shadows began to move, and then, from deep within the jungle, something screamed. The fire flickered, casting shaky shadows across the trees, but none of us felt its warmth. The air was cold, impossible cold, a creeping chill that crawled over our skin, sinking deep into our bones, draining the heat from our bodies. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. We stood frozen as if breathing too loudly would bring them closer. And then, they stepped out of the darkness. At first, they were only shapes, vague figures shifting between the trees. Then, they became clearer, tall, still, dressed in colonial clothing, like echoes of a long-dead era. But the clothing wasn't the problem. It was what they lacked, where their eyes, mouths, and faces should have been. There was only smooth, pale skin, empty, expressionless, wrong. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, but then they started walking, and my world fell apart. "Fire!" Diego bellowed, his voice more desperate than commanding. Gunfire erupted. Musket balls tore through the air, hitting the figures. Nothing. No reaction. No blood. No bodies falling. They kept walking. "God help us," one of the soldiers whispered. Another shot rang out. Another miss. The bullets passed right through them as if they weren't even there. One of them got close enough for me to see the details of what shouldn't exist. The pale, stretched skin where a face should be. The worn-out clothing, stitched from a style that wasn't ours. The sound of heavy footsteps, but no mouth to breathe. My body locked up. My mind refused to understand. And then, a scream. Short, sharp, and then silence. I turned. He was gone. Another soldier tried to run, sprinting toward the forest. He didn't make it 2 steps before something unseen pulled him back. He vanished into the trees, without a single sound. Panic rippled through the camp. Some men ran blindly into the undergrowth. Others fumbled with trembling hands, trying to reload their muskets. "Stay together," Diego ordered, but his voice shook. The walkers kept coming. I saw one of them stop in front of a soldier. The man dropped to his knees, muttering prayers, his face streaked with tears. The walker didn't hesitate. It simply lifted a hand and placed it on his forehead. The man froze. His eyes rolled back, his body stiffened, and then his face began to disappear, his eyes, nose, mouth, swallowed by his own skin, as if his face was consuming itself. And before any of us could react, he stood up again. But now, he was one of them. That's when I understood they didn't kill, they transformed, and we were next. I ran. My breath came in gasps, my vision blurred by sweat and dirt. The world was collapsing behind me. Muffled screams, cut-off pleas, the snap of branches, and leaves crushed under feet that shouldn't exist. I didn't want to look back. I didn't want to see what the walkers were doing to the others. Then, my foot caught on a root. I slammed into the ground. The impact knocked the air from my lungs. My torch rolled forward, its flames flickering, casting dancing shadows against something that shouldn't be there. A stone entrance, a dark crack between the ruins like a gaping mouth waiting to swallow me whole. I didn't think. I just crawled inside, grabbing the torch before it could go out. The sounds of slaughter outside faded, and then I lifted the torch and saw the walls. And that's when I knew. The stones were covered in Mayan inscriptions, cryptic symbols flickering under the torch's dim glow. Some I recognized: sacrifice, death, offering, punishment. But it was the carved figures that froze me in place, the fight. First image showed the invaders, men with pale skin wearing armor like us. They came from the sea, bringing fire and steel. The next scene, Mayan priests gathered around an altar. They cut their own flesh, offering their blood to the forgotten gods. And then, the last image, the faceless walkers, tall, pale, human, yet not human. They weren't ghosts, they were the invaders themselves. The men who came before us, the ones who defiled the temples, condemned to wander forever. No face, no voice, no identity. The ones who disappeared didn't die. They became the guardians. My body locked up. My fingers clenched the torch as if it could push back the horror that had just unfolded before me. And then, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, torch raised, nerves on edge, ready to see one of them emerge from the darkness. But it wasn't them. It was Diego. The captain looked like a broken man. His clothes were torn, filthy. His face was slick with sweat and soot. wild eyes darting like a man teetering on the edge of madness. His sword was still in his hand, but he didn't seem to know why. "They can't kill us, they can't kill us," he murmured, trembling. I tried to speak, but he didn't hear me. "This isn't real. This can't be real." Then, he turned and ran. "Diego, no!" I shouted, but he was already gone. Swallowed by the trees, I never heard his voice again. No footsteps, nothing, just the silence of the jungle. And at that moment I realized I was alone. I didn't want to leave, but staying was worse. With my torch shaking in my hand, I stepped out of the chamber where I had discovered the truth. The air outside felt even heavier, thick with the stench of rot and fear. The clearing where we had set up camp was gone. The jungle had swallowed it whole, or maybe it had never been there. Of the 14 soldiers who had set out, only 4 remained. "We have to get out of here." Hernando's voice was as broken as his mind. I didn't argue. We ran, but the jungle wouldn't let us go. The vegetation twisted around us, the trees closing in, branches snagging our clothes, roots grasping at our feet. Then, we heard them. Screams. Screams. That didn't sound human. We turned back, and we saw Diego. He was trying to run, but they found him first. Emerging from the shadows, the walkers encircled him like predators cornering wounded prey. He swung his sword uselessly, slashing at nothing. Like a man trying to fight the wind, "Stay away." One of them touched him. Diego stopped screaming. He dropped to his knees, eyes wide and empty. His fingers released the sword, his hands trembled. And then, his face began to disappear. His eyes were swallowed by his skin. His nose, his mouth, gone. He was still alive, but he had no face, no identity. Now he was one of them. I wanted to help him, but my legs had already made the decision for me. I ran. Hernando ran beside me, gasping for air. Behind us, another scream. One of the last remaining soldiers vanished into the darkness. It was just the 2 of us now. I tried to remember the way back. I searched for any sign of civilization. But the jungle was endless. The shadows moved around. With each step, I felt them getting closer. Then, Hernando tripped. I wanted to help him, but it was already too late. Before I could reach him, a pale hand shot out of the darkness, grabbing his leg. "Rodrigo, no." I saw it. I watched his face vanish, and then he stood up. Now he was one of them. That's when I understood. There was no escape, but I refused to become one of them. So I did the only thing I could. I kept running, without looking back, without thinking, without breathing, just running from what cannot be understood, and against all logic, against the curse of this land. The jungle let me go, but I knew the truth. I never really escaped. They are still watching me, and one day, they will. Come for me. The jungle never returns what it takes. The villagers from the nearest settlement already knew that. They knew that when white men venture too deep into the forest, they don't come back. They knew that the ancient temples were not just stone and moss, but tombs of secrets that were never meant to be unearthed. And that's why, when a young hunter found the journal lying on the ground, he didn't touch it immediately. The leather cover was damp from the morning mist. The pages, stained by humidity, still held the ink. Someone had written in it recently, but there were no footprints around the book. Nothing but a trail of steps leading out of the jungle and ending in nothing. The village elder took the journal with a heavy expression. He opened it carefully, breathing in the scent of death soaked into the pages. The handwriting was shaky, as if the hand that had written it was weak or desperate. If anyone finds this, please listen to my warning. My name is Rodrigo de Olmos. I am, or was, a soldier of the Spanish expedition led by Captain Diego de Ayala. We were sent to find gold. We found something far worse. The elder turned. More pages. The handwriting became more erratic. The account described the temple, the disappearances, the walkers, the faces fading into emptiness. And then, near the end, the last words hastily scribbled. They don't kill. They turn us. I saw them take Diego. I saw Hernando vanish before my eyes. I ran until my lungs burned, but it doesn't matter. The jungle let me go, but I know the truth. They are still watching me. They are always watching. And when I close my eyes, I will be one of them. The final page was stained with something dark, ink or blood. And then, nothing. The men from the village went to the clearing where the journal had been found. They found no bodies, no armor, no swords, no trace of the expedition. Only footprints, marks that emerged from the jungle, walked into the clearing, and then stopped abruptly, as if whoever had left them had simply ceased to exist. The elder looked into the forest around them. He knew they were not alone. The spirits of the jungle, the guardians of the forgotten gods, never rest. And as long as there are fools willing to trespass into their domain, the legend of the Faceless Walkers will live on, waiting for new intruders, waiting for new souls, waiting for you.